In the summer of 1995, the fourth United Nations Conference on Women was held in Beijing, China. It came just 1 year after the UN conference in Cairo, Egypt, at which the delegation of the Holy See challenged many of the positions contained in the proposed document for the conference. Pope John Paul II himself perceived great dangers to marriage and family in the policy document presented at Cairo. The Beijing conference, on the other hand, seemed to engender far less confrontation. Had Pope John Paul scored such a decisive victory at Cairo that there was no need for challenges at Beijing? Did the proposed Beijing document not try to eliminate references to such basic institutions as motherhood and family? Can the Church now let down her guard against moral challenges at United Nations conferences? These are some of the questions to which we will seek answers on this episode of the St. Charles Forum.
Eternal Word Television Network presents the St. Charles Forum from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Hello and welcome to the St. Charles Forum as we discuss the UN Beijing Conference. We're very privileged to have with us three women who served on the delegation of the Holy See to the Beijing Conference. They were in China and were intimately involved in the debates and discussions. They are, first of all, Gail Quinn of the Pro-Life Committee of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops.
Hello,
welcome.
John, and thank
Gail.
you for having me.
And Patricia Dano, whose full-time work is in foundations, but she was a member of the Holy See's delegation to Beijing, pardon me. And Sheri Rickert, who is an attorney in New York City and who is on the staff of the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations.
Hi, John.
Welcome to all three. Pardon my being tongue-tied there. It was that bright red dress that got me thrown off. No. Here in this show, we're actually going to be responding to our viewers. We did a preliminary show on Beijing, and we received quite a number of requests to do a follow-up. And so we're very happy to do that, and it's exciting having people who are actually in Beijing. But first of all, for the sake of many of our viewers, I'd like to inform them as to what these United Nations conferences are really all about. Gail, this is the fourth UN conference on women held by the United Nations.
On women, it is the fourth conference that they've had. The first was in 1970, I believe. Then they had a kind of a quick catch-up in 1975 to see how they were doing, 85 and 95. The United Nations has conferences on major issues around the world quite frequently. I mean, there was one in Cairo, we had this one in Beijing. Right after that, there was one in Copenhagen.
What was that about?
That was on social development, just for a quick phrase.
And Pip, you were at Copenhagen, weren't you?
Yes, I was on the delegation for that conference. Has the direction been on development? This series of 5 conferences that the UN has had recently has focused on development, environment development, population development.
Every conference is supposed to have a different focus. For example, in Rio, they had the one on the environment. They also had a conference in Vienna on human rights. And then Cairo, obviously, was population and development, and the Social Summit in Copenhagen. And this was a series in 5, but that's unusual because usually they're spaced further apart.
So it's not necessarily that a general convention is held every year. I mean, it's more arbitrary than that.
Right.
Yeah, it is more arbitrary. The other thing which seems to be happening with these UN conferences, besides the fact that the recent ones have focused somewhat on development, is you find women's issues as such being brought more and more to the front of some of these conferences. So when the conference on Cairo was over, you had pretty much a women's document.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's the purpose of these conferences, though? And what comes out of them? Sheri, the one that was held in Cairo, what did it want to accomplish?
Well, ostensibly, it was supposed to be to address population and development. As you probably know, part of our problem with the Holy See delegation was there was a whole document and only about 3 pages were addressing development, and the rest was on population-related issues. But as Gail was saying, there are certain groups that are getting involved in these and have a very powerful coalition, and one of them is the so-called women's groups, women's organizations who are getting involved. And so, of course, they were much more interested in the Beijing conferences. And for them, this was a big chance to bring together everything they'd gained in these previous conferences and kind of make this a big grand finale, if you will.
One built on the other, you almost might say. The first big efforts were Cairo. And then
You mean on the part of the
on the part of the
feminist
women's,
groups?
the feminist groups, the Women's Caucus, which is quite powerful, headed by Bella Abzug. But then even in Copenhagen, the next conference that took place, there was an effort to try to build on that.
To sort of push further than
Yeah, each one we want to go
agenda.
one step further.
The feminist agenda, if
The
you will.
feminist agenda, yes. And when you got to the Beijing agenda, I mean, in the press, the Women's Caucus was saying, we're going to get this because we wrote it and we're not going to let it go down. So it was an effort to build on that.
Well,
And
now,
it's good to point out with that it's not feminism in the broad sense of the term. It's a feminist group with a very limited, almost radical agenda to go on. And so there are other women's groups that are getting involved that don't go along with that agenda, but they're getting on kind of late on the game, and they're having to attack things that have already been gained by this
but
particular
aren't these
coalition.
conferences held for the member nations? I mean, there are different countries. Do all the countries send delegations to these conferences?
Most all the countries. Here and there, a country may not have a representative.
Then
But-
how could special interest groups like women's caucuses
Well,
play such an influential role when really sovereign states are supposed to be sending delegations to hammer out these
There's-
documents?
It's sort of the constituencies of the various countries, and they exert pressure within the country if they're a large enough entity, and then they have coalitions among countries even, so they have a larger lobbying background. power.
And this kind of effort has really been welcomed by the United Nations too, I think. They want more, you want to call it grassroots involvement, and so they're getting that. While this conference took on in Beijing, we talk about the Beijing conference, there were two Beijing conferences going on. One was represented by the nations of the country, and these women's groups and others had influence on it in the way you and I might try to have influence on Congress in Washington. But at the same time, the non-government groups were meeting out in another city. They had their own agenda. They had their own program.
And these were special interest groups that were meeting at the
Yes.
same time as the
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
Beijing conference.
Yeah.
Well, Sheri, what comes out of these conferences? I mean, a document's drawn up, they vote on it, they issue the document. For what end? What's the purpose of it?
This question kind of links into what was just being discussed, actually, because I was going to mention it's not just countries who pick out government officials to go to these conferences. There are also special interest groups who infiltrate and are able to sponsor their own delegates on each of these delegations. For example, it was well known that in the Cairo conference, International Planned Parenthood Federation sponsored their own delegations for many of these government delegations that represented Planned Parenthood interests, for example.
Now, I just want to get that straight.
Sure.
I mean, Planned Parenthood would see to it that they had representatives on the delegations from particular countries.
Sure.
And they would pay the way of those delegations.
Oh, they would pay the way of
Yes,
those
exactly.
delegates?
You'd
How
have a poor
interesting.
country that maybe couldn't send 6 people to a foreign work country. Planned Parenthood would step in and say, we'll send these 6 people for you and don't worry about the cost.
Oh,
We've
very
covered it."
interesting. Oh, and that's a way they're able to exercise
And
more
so
influence.
many times the position that a government will display at a conference doesn't necessarily reflect the laws and the policies of that government. They might more reflect the positions of the individual delegations who are in a particular negotiating posture. But then this reflects what happens with the documents that come out of the conferences. They don't have any legally binding nature to them. Nobody can go, for example, and sue a country for not implementing the aspects of this document. However, a lot of provisions are put in and then used for lobbying efforts for later on, for example, for these powerful interest groups to go to various governments, especially in developing countries that are sensitive to pressure like that. And to say, but you agreed in this document, or the international community has agreed to this particular policy, what are you doing to implement that? We'll give you the money to implement it, and here is what you should be doing. And it has a very powerful lobbying effect in what they do.
But that's principally how it works. As you say, there's no legally binding character
none at
to
all.
these
No, it's
documents.
not.
Yeah.
Well, how is it that the church gets involved in this? If we're talking about the United Nations and delegations going from different countries, how is it that the Catholic Church can have a delegation?
Well, as probably most of your viewers know, the Holy See is a city-state, and it and Switzerland have special status at the United Nations as an observer.
You mean Switzerland's not a member?
No.
It's just an
when there's
observer,
also.
like the Holy See.
Yes,
So
yes.
those are the
But
two.
when you go into these conferences, I mean, we don't go into the Security Council, those kind of things. But when you have these conferences, the Holy See and Switzerland are active members of the conference, and as such, they speak to it. And I think make a strong impact on, you know.
There are even other countries that don't have any participation at the United Nations, but these international conferences are only sponsored by the United Nations. They're actually meant to reach an agreement of consensus between all the countries of the world, so every country has a right to participate on a full basis at the conferences, regardless of their position at the United Nations.
Pip, how many were on the Holy See's delegation to Beijing?
We ended up with 22 members from a variety of countries.
Is that an average size delegation?
No, I'd say that's a large.
Oh, that's a large one.
It's large for the Holy See. It doesn't come any place close to what some of the large nations do. United States, I think, had 45 or more.
70, I think 60
Did
to
they go that
70.
high?
Yes.
Japan brings a great number, but for the Holy See, a group of 22 is quite large.
And
think
Pip,
there
who headed up the U.S. delegation?
The U.S. delegation?
I'm sorry, the Holy See
delegation. Marianne Glendon, Dr. Marianne Glendon, who's a law professor at Harvard, very articulate, and I thought she did a wonderful job.
Yeah.
Because she did the formal presentations and statements representing the delegation, meeting with other countries. Several countries asked to meet with the Holy See, and she would be the representative. And particularly with the Beijing conference, because there were a lot of human rights issues.
So she, as an attorney, could effectively address
not
those?
Just as an attorney, but she's also done a lot of work in the rights area, particularly for women on divorce and children's issues. So I thought she was really a very fine choice and did a very effective job.
Who did head up the U.S. delegation?
Madeline Albright?
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
she was the formal.
Yeah, formal, but I don't know who.
I would assume Madeline Albright
Probably, yeah.
would have been.
We were there.
Ambassador.
you were busy with your own.
We were the
delegation.
negotiators, so we didn't get to go to the formal parties and meet those people.
The Holy See had about, what do we have, 7 people that negotiated.
I see.
And that's what you did
Full
That's
time.
all
what you were
day
involved
and
in.
night.
All night,
Yeah,
and-
yeah.
But it was very useful on our delegation. As Pip said, we had representatives from all over the world, from every region, and women with various backgrounds. We had one who is a religious sister from Vietnam, for existence. We had a married couple from Chile. We had people with professional as well as married background and children. So it's very interesting to get together and talk with each other as a delegation about these issues, because you got both the cultural perspective as well as very, very different perspectives.
Now, does the delegation from the Holy See look at itself as representing the interests of the church, or does it look at itself as trying to address the needs of humanity by bringing the special insights provided by our Catholic faith?
Well, I think actually you're talking about the same thing. Those of us who believe in the social teaching of the Church believe it's good not only for Catholics, but it's good for social policy in general. And we find that over and over again in the policies of the United Nations. The things that we espouse from the position of the Church actually are for the good of society, for women and individuals.
Very rich
And also, the Holy See has a special job of being a voice for the poor and the ones that aren't heard. I think that's a real, you see that in the way the Holy See delegation operates. That's what they're for, to be the voice for those that don't have a voice there.
To give voice to those who don't have voices, yes. And I assume that they're just drawn from contacts that the Church has throughout the world in terms of finding the members of the delegation.
That's true, and they do come from all over the world, and perhaps given people have special expertise depending on what the conference is about.
Okay, well, that's an interesting background, and we'll take a break and proceed to a discussion of the conference itself.
The St. Charles Forum will continue in a moment.
Welcome back to the St. Charles Forum. We're discussing the Beijing conference, and I'm going to put a question to Pip Donahoe. Can you tell us exactly what the Beijing conference was?
Well, the official title, besides being the 4th World Conference on Women, was Women for Peace, Equality, and Development. And it was to be a follow-up on the Nairobi conference, which, following the document from that, the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies. This was to be an implementation of that conference. specifically in the areas of peace, equality, and development for women.
So it was to be carrying through the themes that have been developed in prior women's conferences.
Exactly.
I'm just curious, has there ever been a United Nations conference on men?
It's a good idea.
Not no, I haven't heard of that one.
Well, my wife keeps telling me I need a lot of help, so maybe we ought to
We'll send
consider
you to
one.
the UN and we'll talk about it. for a while.
But, you know, a lot of talk at this conference was, why are all the women and just the women coming to this? It's actually the men who need to hear all of this, and so that's a good point.
Well, one of the things I think, we talk about what was this conference about? That was its subtitle, peace, development, equality. But there was there's many good things in this document, by the way. It's not all bad. It says many good things about the need for education of girls. I mean, there's some countries where you have a girl and a boy. The boy gets the education, not the girl. It says many good things about health in general, but there's a decided effort in this document, or there was, to push forward on certain strategies, again, of interest to radical feminists, if you will. It's a document loaded with language on equality. Great difficulty dealing with human dignity. Didn't want to hear that word. It was terrible.
Now, why would it not want to hear that word?
There are some who argue that that's a way to keep women in their place.
To refer
now,
to dignity?
Yeah, don't ask me to defend that because I don't know how.
That maybe it vies with equality somehow, but I don't know quite. I don't.
But
understand
it
why.
reads like a document of women alone, all by themselves, as very self-sufficient beings.
Rather than seeing them integrated within families and
Yeah.
the larger
Yes.
It's sort of like
social
it
body.
doesn't reflect reality. When you read the document, you don't realize that the majority of women marry and have children. Now, there are women that don't, and they should be addressed. But by reading the document, you think all women don't get married and don't have children.
Well, it's curious. We hear a lot about the Cairo conference. Of course, the Cairo conference was a year prior to Beijing. And a lot of women's issues came up there as well, but the Cairo conference wasn't a women's conference. Sheri, why were women's issues so much a part of that conference? What was the theme of Cairo officially?
It was population and development. It had various sections within the document, but almost the entire document, almost every other paragraph or every paragraph referred to reproductive health and reproductive rights.
Women, in other words.
Yeah, exactly.
As if that's just women's issues.
Yeah,
That's all
yeah.
women are concerned about.
And there's the concept, and it's a legitimate concept, that development has to involve women. Women are 50% or whatever the population. And that if women are involved in development, then they have to have certain control over resources, education, and also they have to have control over their fertility, was a big catchphrase that kept being used. Unfortunately, that kept running down to provision of population control, fertility control programs, and things like education and other laudable points that should be supported were left out in the fringe,
So that
especially in the
happened-
resources that were
In
attributed.
fact, at that Cairo conference, when it all was said and done, and they had a final document, all the things that you might call development, they're in there. Short shrift, but they're in there. No resources accorded to them. But when you come into the programs that have to do with control of fertility or reproductive rights and health, that's where money was allocated.
Huh.
So
And
it's very telling.
Now, is that where the Holy Father became nervous when he saw the developments that were going into Cairo? I mean, he did write a letter to the head of state of every country in the world, did he not?
Well, I think, it
expressing
wasn't
his grave
just that. It
concerns
was
about the
concerned
issues?
about the whole underlying ideology that's behind this, about seeing women separate from marriage and the family separated from marriage between a man and a woman, of seeing children separated from the responsibility, rights, and duties of parents to oversee them in their development, especially in the area of sexuality. It's seeing development as control of people instead of using people and enabling people to develop. These were all, very heavy underlying concepts that the Holy Father was very rightly concerned about.
Now, that there was no programmatic or logical link between the Cairo conference and Beijing, is that right?
Not officially, and also, Pip was mentioning this was supposed to follow up on the implementation of the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies 10 years earlier, but all of the language, in fact, during the negotiations, entire sections of Cairo were reinserted, especially
Oh,
those
really?
that dealt with
Yes.
reproductive rights and
Yes.
reproductive health. things that focus on fertility control were reinserted in total from the Cairo document. So theoretically, it was supposed to be from Nairobi. In practice, it was just a continuation of the Cairo conference.
Because of the emphasis, or some people's view that women's issues are just reproductive issues. Again, that emphasis.
How open were the delegations at these conferences to, let's say, the church's moral teaching on the regulation of births, that is natural family planning? Or did it always just come down to contraception and abortion?
Yeah, I think natural family planning is actually mentioned.
It actually made it in the Beijing document.
And the Norwegian delegation, I think, is very pro breastfeeding as a country.
Which is something that the Holy See got into this document.
And so that is in the document also as a means of fertility regulation. But those are rather minor compared to the usual reproductive control.
Yeah. When you get into the area of reproductive services, especially young people, providing services to children without their parents' knowledge, much less consent.
Now,
there's nations that agree with the Holy See, certainly.
But are there people trying to get those kinds of statements or ideas into an international document?
My goodness, yes. You know, there were nations there who basically said, if this document is filled with language, they use shorthand, parents' language, well, we're probably not going to be able to agree with it. They thought nothing should be in there. Again, it goes back to this ideology of seeing the almighty individual, if you will, and taking that down to the level of childhood.
And you also have an international organization presuming to offer guidelines to parents in the most intimate kinds of relationships in the various cultures of the world. I mean, doesn't that go actually even beyond what the United Nations was created to do?
And the funny thing was that it's not the guidelines that they're doing for parents so much. It's guidelines for organizations, health services groups, to treat your child or my child without your knowledge, and you better not get in the way.
And and watching the development of the whole parental language, the parental rights and duties language that's in these documents. At Cairo, we went through a major argument about it, and we finally basically agreed on language that comes from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then at Copenhagen, that same language is adopted again, where you could see a major lobbying push at the Beijing conference, where that was one of the major issues, was on the rights of parents to oversee the sexual development of their children.
And was that granted in the final document?
Well, finally it was. For example, the European Union at first insisted that no parental language could go in this document, even though there are some very objectionable paragraphs on the education and provision of reproductive health services to children. You know, we're not just talking adolescents here. And so, but the way it was finally negotiated, they actually even managed to water down what was so vehemently negotiated in Cairo, to where it's almost as if the children's rights and the parents' rights are in contrast or in confrontation with each other, and the children's rights should overrule, is what one could interpret this document as giving.
So parents' rights was one of the big issues going into Beijing.
One of the hottest issues.
What were some of the others? Because this document, so our viewers know, there are preparatory documents prepared, right? There's a document drawn up prior to the conference itself, right? What were some of the big issues coming up Pip, you were involved, weren't you, in the
Gail was mentioning that there are good things in the text, but all the press and all the main confrontation was not about those good sections. And one of the most controversial was the health section. And just to show that the focus of a certain coalition on it, the majority of the health section is on reproductive issues and not other main.
Broader than that.
Exactly, and for women too, as if that's the only health concern women have. When you think we're talking about the world, and tropical diseases being one of the good example of the millions and millions of cases of tropical diseases, and I think it's mentioned twice in the text.
Incredible.
Where the reproductive and AIDS and those issues are mentioned over and over. Have like 20 paragraphs just exclusively. So it's this disproportionate view, or this distorted view of women and women's lives. That's what I find so distressing about the document.
Because you find ideologies then taking over.
It's not reality, and it doesn't address the real problems of women and needs of women.
Well, even those good points that are covered, though, the distressing thing is there's no resources for many of them. And the good things are things like poverty alleviation and education and peace, refugee issues. There's no money allocated to any of those things. And when we were negotiating the health section, there would be good paragraphs come up on basic health care provision. Some women in the world can't have access to an antibiotic pill, but they can be let into a whole room of contraceptives if they want. But the problem is, when any of those basic health paragraphs were introduced, you'd have, for example, like wording, provide women with all their basic health needs. Inevitably, you'd have some delegation immediately pipe up and want to insert, in particular or especially, sexual and reproductive health every single time, even if you'd already just addressed that issue in the prior paragraph.
Incredible.
So it's very disconcerting walking out of that mentality.
Now, in preparation for the conference, the documents debated ahead of time in New York, I guess, or it could be other places around the world.
In preparatory conferences. There are 3 preparatory conferences?
There were 3 for this conference, yeah.
Now, I understand that the preparatory document had certain words in brackets going in. What was the significance of that?
Well, the way that the UN works for these conferences is when they meet at these preparatory conferences, and you agree on all that you can agree on easily. And it's a fairly painless process. And where you do not agree, they say bracket it. And so anything that's within brackets is a term or a concept upon which agreement could not be reached.
Now, wait a minute. It's a term or concept on which agreement can't be reached. But I understand that mother and motherhood was bracketed.
Was a problem. Family was a problem.
Now, how in the world?
Human
was
rights was a problem.
Spiritual was a problem.
Well, now, inform me, please, how mother or motherhood could be a problem.
Well, we didn't think it was a problem, John.
But somebody
did. What objection
some
could there be?
delegations view motherhood, and this is an emphasis in the draft, it's a little different in the final document, that motherhood was something that kept women from progressing in the economic or social sphere. So they didn't want the emphasis to be on motherhood, but helping women in again, the social and economic sphere. So you did get references to motherhood, but a lot of them were negative, that it wasn't a good thing so much, but more of something that keeps you in the home and therefore not progressing.
Well, we only have about a minute left, but gender was also a word that was bracketed. Why would that have been bracketed? I mean,
Well, there was some confusion during the preparatory conferences. What did that term mean?
doesn't it mean male and female?
I think so. You think so? But it was difficult because there were some who said it was purposely used to broaden the term to mean lesbian couples and gay couples, but nobody could define it well. But during the summer, there was a meeting specifically on that word to say, what does it mean? An agreement was reached. It means what everybody has always thought it meant, which they did not bother to define.
Well, but we know, and
but
that's
it
some
took it off the,
consolation. And we'll continue after this break to discuss the Beijing conference.
Stay tuned. The St. Charles Forum will return in just a moment.
Welcome back to our discussion of the Beijing conference. All of you were involved in the preparations for the conference. It must have been exciting to board the plane to head off for China itself. Had any of you ever been to China?
I haven't.
No.
It was a 19-hour plane trip.
Oh my goodness!
So it was long.
Were there expectations that weren't met? Did it wind up being different than what you had anticipated, just in terms of going to China?
For me, it was. I mean, you did get off a plane into another culture, which was fascinating, but it was a little bit more Western than I had expected. Everybody in China rides bicycles. You had hordes of people on bicycles every day, going every place. They're wider than our traffic lanes here. But they weren't dressed like I thought the Chinese would be dressed. They were dressed in business suits, women and men both. So they're westernizing, which was
They are westernizing, but it's still quite a totalitarian system, isn't it? Did you have a sense of the authoritarianism of the regime?
Yeah. We actually, every morning, of course, our delegation would have Mass together. And we actually heard the second or third day that we were assigned a Chinese hostess who was supposed to help us and to accommodate our stay there. And about the second or third day, I hear that she asked Professor Glendon what we were doing in this room every morning. And Professor Glendon explained we were having Mass. It was a religious ceremony. And our hostess clarified that nobody outside the delegation was attending. And then a couple of days later, we were all given a little booklet on religious freedom in China, which I understood basically said we were breaking the law.
Yeah,
but
that you
nothing
couldn't have
happened
Mass
about
there,
that.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That was, for me, having Mass there every day, given some work I've done with religious freedom issues in China, it was very startling to think something we take so for granted, like just going to Mass every day. People could be arrested for that in China. And, it's a different country. You're in a different place.
Well, it seems rather peculiar that the United Nations would have chosen China as a place to discuss basic fundamental human rights issues.
Especially for women. Of all things. Yeah, it was a...
Well, why?
I'm not quite sure why they chose China, but it was a...
Why would it be particularly
understand.
problematic for have women's issues discussed in China?
Because of the one-child policy in China, women have no choice when it comes to their reproductive rights, whether or not they can have more than one child.
That's by law, they're coerced by the state?
law, forced
Yeah.
abortion, forced contraception. And
There
so
are women-
when here a conference that inordinately dwelt on reproductive rights, it was in a country where there really were no reproductive
Was that brought
rights.
up?
It's also
Was there a way of bringing it up in that context?
not on the floor of the United Nations meeting, because that's not done.
It was a bit in the sense that forced abortion, there was discussion that forced abortion should not be allowed, but it couldn't be done by naming particular countries. It doesn't work that way.
I mean, we have Chinese nationals here in this country, women and some men who don't want to go home, because if they go home, they'll be forcibly sterilized. They had faced forced abortion in their own country before, and the Congress is trying to do something about that now. So it's a very serious problem. It's also a country in which reportedly there's a great amount of infanticide if the child is a girl. So
And this
of all
was a
the places
conference on
on the
women.
earth to have
Exactly.
a conference on women, that was a very strange choice.
Well, there was some opposition to having it in Beijing, wasn't there? There
was by groups, but once one of these things is resolved politically, and it's the General Assembly of the United Nations that decides where the conferences will be held, it's very hard politically for these countries to go back, especially if they have relations with China. They certainly don't want to affect their diplomatic relations in other areas.
Now, when they come up with the final document, do all the member states or delegations from the member states vote? Or do they raise hands and say, okay, we have a 3/4 majority and we'll pass it?
They do things the other way around at the United Nations. It's not that you positively vote for or speak for. If you don't speak, you're presumed to assent.
Silence
agree.
gives
You're
consent.
presumed to
Silence
agree
is
with it.
consent. Yeah, consent. But so you must speak if you disagree. Now, when they finished with this document in Beijing, 43 nations, I think that was the number, right?
It was over 40.
Yeah, it's over 40.
They joined the consensus, but they issued very serious reservations on portions of the document,
Especially the health section.
especially the health section and the how children are treated vis-a-vis their parents.
Now, how long is this document? How many pages? is it?
165,
165.
give or take.
Single-spaced.
Oh my
Yes,
goodness.
single spaced, right,
Very
yes.
long.
And how many countries were involved in the conference?
181, I think, was the number. So you're talking a good 25% or more.
Of countries who had serious
right.
reservations
Where-
about the
yes.
final document.
Because they work not on majority rule, or this is as they present it, but in consensus, that we have a consensus to this document. And I found it to be a concern that even when certain sections were being passed, that there were several countries at that point, which is not the usual place for reservations, were making reservations, having difficulties. And yet, it didn't seem to matter. One after another, they still said it was a consensus.
Yeah, and they keep pushing these things through the negotiation. And they were under obvious time pressures, but even things that obviously had serious divisions on the floor, many times the chairperson would push it through, even if it wasn't a consensus.
So that can't be
Yeah.
done.
And their response was, take a reservation if you don't like it.
Oh,
Right. So what I want to raise is, how many voices do we have to have before it's not a consensus? How many?
That's a good
What's the
point,
number?
yeah.
Well, tell us the number, and
But they don't say that. I mean, they
No,
don't say
because they say it's not a majority decision. It's
But
a
another
consensus.
interesting point on this is a lot of those countries that took reservations and statements, especially at Beijing, were silent during the negotiation process, or they weren't even in the negotiations. So for us, the question kept coming up, who are these delegates and who are they representing? You know, it's very nice to have a lot of women at a conference, but we noticed a lot of these women had never been at a prior conference. They didn't understand the process. For example, I had one delegate from a developing country come up to me in the middle of a very serious negotiation, like 3 days after we'd been on a topic, and say, by the way, excuse me, where'd you get that document? It was the Platform for Action. And I told her what it was, and she said, do you think you could show me where to get it? You know, and so many of these women, again, it was very good that they were there, but no experience, obviously no training. Many of them had no idea about the subtle concepts and politics that go on at a conference. And so a lot of times they were taking reservations, and for the first time you were hearing that they had a problem with the document, which is not how theoretically these things
And
It
apparently
doesn't
there are
work
a lot of code words apparently that somebody new to this, well, like who would think that motherhood or gender or even family, what would they use in place of family?
The family in its various forms sounds rather innocent, but when you start seeing it in the context, then you see what it's trying to supplant, you know, put alternate lifestyle, so to speak, in the place of the marriage-based
Like
family.
gay and lesbian unions and call them families as
Even
well.
the word families, which is a benign term, I mean, I use it, you probably use it all the time.
Sure, put it in the plural.
It's over, if you've watched like the population conferences going back over a number of years, as well as the women's conferences, trying to broaden the definition of the family has been part and parcel of an effort to just keep moving this along. It was true in Beijing, and it's the same old fight all over again. But there are groups there, in mainly Western countries, who want to change the term family to families.
Which again
then,
means
because for
gay
them
and
that would
lesbian
mean
unions.
Means anything.
yes, it would mean homosexual couples.
Well, Pip, you were saying earlier that you were astounded at the degree of lack of knowledge of some delegates about some basic terms, and that there were women demonstrating for lesbian rights.
Oh, yes, at the non-governmental conference, there was a large contingent of lesbians in that one, and we got to hear some very entertaining stories. My favorite was some journalist was out watching, and the lesbians were demonstrating human rights for lesbians, and he saw a Chinese woman, and he went up to her and said, do you understand what that means? And she says, oh, yes. And do you agree with it? Well, oh, yes, human rights are very important, and everyone should have human rights. And she paused, and then she asked, but maybe you could tell me, where's lesbia? So you did get, and some of the Muslim countries too, you did get, they were somewhat startled by the very presence of the strong presence of the lesbians.
So that means that those in the know, I mean, those who are helping to put together the agenda, the overarching agenda, really have a tremendous advantage over the delegations from the various member states, no?
Yeah, especially developing countries and the poor countries that don't have the Western mentality, because it really is a Western mentality that goes into the development of these documents. I mean, another example was...
A kind of disordered Western mentality, if you will.
Exactly.
Oh, I'll say it. You don't have to say it. I'll say it.
Written on Madison Avenue. Okay.
Current Western attitude.
But even there's language difficulties, because you know there are 5 official languages at the UN. There's French, Spanish, English, Russian, and Chinese. But all the negotiation is carried on in English. And so there was a problem when sexual orientation was introduced in 4 or 5 different paragraphs. Remove all barriers for women because of their sexual orientation. And we were surprised that especially some African delegations weren't speaking up and didn't seem terribly concerned about all this. And we later found out that those French-speaking delegations, for them, orientation in French, means education. And they couldn't see any problem with removing barriers to sex education. And when they found out that sexual orientation means homosexuality, they obviously changed their position on that. But there's a lot of cultural and linguistic difficulties that happen.
I mean, critical human issues at stake here, and great difficulty in truly
and a
addressing
lot are
them.
at a great disadvantage just because of the language
Because of the
problem.
language.
Yeah. Sometimes not only would the discussions take place in English, but documents would be refined and given out again only in English. So, I mean, if Chinese was your language, you're stuck. You know?
How free were you to speak at the plenary sessions and at the negotiating committee meetings?
Well-
Did you feel any restrictions on your
In the plenary, every delegation has an opportunity to make a formal statement, and Dr. Glendon obviously did for the Holy See delegation, and that was a prepared statement that was given. But in the negotiations themselves, we find especially that sometimes there are different tactics. It's a very political environment. And obviously a chairperson who has a particular perspective or an agenda to further will do her best to further that agenda using the powers that she has as a chairperson. However, there's also a lot of misunderstanding, even in the United Nations, about the role of the Holy See. For example, we're an observer at the United Nations in New York, but at these conferences we're a full-fledged member and have all the rights of participation of a full-fledged member. But for example, in one of my sessions, the chairperson told me that I couldn't make a point of order on a very controversial issue, that she didn't like our position because we're an observer country, and she refused to give me the chair again for some time.
To which you had a right
Yes,
under the rules of the United Nations.
That's right. And by the time we got that clarified with her through the administration, that point was already gone, and we couldn't speak on it anymore.
So you were
these
something
things
at a
always come up.
disadvantage.
Oh, yeah.
Here and
There's
there.
always challenges.
Was the Holy See generally pleased or displeased with the final document? Were there many reservations?
There were a good number of
12
reservations.
reservations.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, it was probably a toss-up towards the end, not at the very end, of what we were going to have to do in terms of that document.
Are there any countries that just withhold agreement with the whole document?
I don't know whether any did this time.
No.
It just
In
isn't
Cairo,
done. You just
it-
Well,
disagree with sections.
You can do it. You can just not join the consensus if you want.
And we took a partial consensus. Did
Right.
any other country take partial?
No, I
Okay.
believe we're
No, I
the
think
only
we were the
ones.
only one.
Partial consensus.
Yeah.
Well, we'll continue this and the consequences of the Beijing conference when we come back after this break.
We'll return in just a moment.
Welcome back to St. Charles Forum and our final segment of discussing the Beijing conference. You were saying right at the end of the last segment that there were reservations to this consensus document on the part of the Holy See, maybe around 12 or so. Mm-hmm. What were the principal issues about which the Holy See had reservations, would you say?
Well, among the things that it wanted to talk about and make clear where it stood were the issue of human rights, what human rights are and what they're based on. It wanted to clarify the importance of the family as the fundamental unit in society. We clarified our points having to do with children and their relation to parents. We made it perfectly clear that the Holy See would not join the consensus in any way, shape, or form with the section on health, because even despite the few good things in it, it was so terribly skewed in terms of sexuality and in a way that we don't agree with.
The final document was.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah.
It really was.
Which means, bottom line here, we're saying it was promoting and advocating contraception, sterilization, abortion. Is that right?
Implicitly. You
Yeah, I
don't
mean, to
see
be
the
blunt,
word
yeah.
sterilization in there, but implicitly it's
That's what it was really talking about.
So one of our reservations would be clarifying what we mean by reproductive, that affirming the Church's position.
Now, do you do that? Does the Holy See issue another document? It says, we have
it's-
rereservations
it's-
about this section, and then
It's
you come
right-
out and
no,
say,
it's right in the
oh,
document.
it's in the document
It will be
itself.
printed when it goes in booklet
Footnoted
form.
Oh.
All of the country's
Just as you would
reservations
word
are in it.
Oh, so
In
the
the
hundred-some
report.
pages could turn out to be
Which was
900-some pages.
Well, but it will
It's
turn
about
out to be a
that.
few more anyway.
Yeah.
an extra.
Which was a funny point from some of the countries did not want, when they spoke about Cairo, when Sheri mentioned that they would take whole text from Cairo to put into this document, they wanted it just from the platform of action. They didn't want it from the report because the report includes the reservations.
Oh, boy.
That's
they
actually
Even want
that's
to
still a
include that.
problem at the United Nations. When they recognized or adopted the Beijing Platform for Action in the General Assembly, several countries had to fight to get recognition of the Platform for Action as adopted, i.e. as including those reservations, because many of the countries didn't want to have recognized that there were countries that had problems with that document.
So there's no end to the maneuvering on these people's part to
No,
get their
There really
agendas
isn't.
across.
There's no end at all.
Well, which document was better in the final analysis from the judgment of the Holy See, Cairo or Beijing? Because you get the impression that the Holy See really struggled and fought in Cairo, won a lot of victories, and that by the time we got to Beijing, the battles were over.
That's not really true.
Yeah,
I mean, you're hearing now that the Holy See wasn't as involved or on top of things there. But, I mean, first of all, I don't think you can say which document was better. We didn't sign either one of them completely. Sign's the wrong word. We didn't join the consensus.
And don't you think victory in Cairo is a little bit, you held things back rather than getting in a better agenda item?
Yes, we kept it from going so far.
You kept it from being worse than it was.
Yeah, we did. And in some ways, in the Beijing document, we got some positive things in there in terms of the family, in terms of motherhood, breastfeeding.
In the consensus document.
In the consensus document. Yeah. So in terms of the importance of freedom of religion and the role that religion plays in the lives of women in a positive vein. So we did accomplish some very positive things there. I think the perception is because we weren't fighting, if you will, as much in the press. And because generally the media weren't as attuned to this conference as it had been to Cairo, it created a misperception, if you will.
But wasn't the reason the media more tuned to Cairo because of the fact that the Holy Father had been so public about his distress over the direction of the Cairo conference?
Well, you know, part of it might be also, it was generally agreed by everybody, including the Holy See, before the Beijing conference, that we would not reopen Cairo. What was agreed, what was fought at Cairo would be left there. We wanted to get on to more important women's issues with the supposition that others also saw that women aren't just reproductive mechanisms. It was our surprise also to get to Beijing and find out that a lot of them, while they were saying that, were reopening Cairo and were furthering their agenda. And at that
Which was upsetting to the Holy See's delegation.
It was very distressing.
And so people were surprised that we weren't fighting more vigorously, but it wasn't a question of not fighting, it was just that we saw no point in reopening that.
Well, haven't there even been those who had served on the Clinton delegation to Beijing who have said that there was more collaboration between the U.S. delegation and the Holy See's delegation?
You know, actually, there's high-level administration officials who've been saying that.
Is it true?
My feeling is they're looking more at elections than that they are at what actually happened at Beijing. We didn't see any change in their strategy or their positions in getting their point across, and we certainly didn't change ours. And so there's obviously no collaboration on those points.
Very supportive.
On the most important points.
So, but what I found distressing about the Beijing document, that it has the same problems from the Cairo document, but because of, again, people reopening the Cairo issues, particularly in the sexual rights area and abortion rights, of trying to further that more language than they had in Cairo.
And parental role
and
also.
The parental.
So that was advanced more in Beijing?
Well, in a sort of twisted way, they didn't end up getting explicit language supporting those things, but they got human rights language in a sort of very vague sense that could be interpreted one way or the other, which I find to be very dangerous for the whole human rights understanding and tradition.
So a lot of human rights and rights terminology was introduced in this document, and probably the thing of concern about that is at Beijing, it was far away from the Western public eye and a lot of the media public eye. And most of these delegates who were there were not human rights experts. They were ideological experts. And they had an ideology to push, and they used human rights and rights terminology to do that. Now that's dangerous not just in terms of how they're pushing their agenda, but also in watering down the whole human rights concept.
Now, how did they do that?
By treating it so disrespectfully.
Well, how did they water down the human rights concept?
Oh, by taking concepts, making very vague generalizations, like a right of a woman to control her own fertility, when that certainly hasn't been defined or discussed. What does that mean? What does it not include?
And then don't forget the broad statement, all women's rights are human rights. Which, if you think about that for 20 seconds, makes absolutely no sense.
Wait a minute, I don't have time to think about it for 20 seconds. Can you tell me why can't we not say that women's rights are human rights?
We can say it in reverse. Human rights are women's rights. They absolutely should be. But if you turn it around, I mean, I, as a woman, have a right to go get my ears pierced if I feel like it. It's not a human right. You just make a mockery of the term human rights. In this country, women have a right by law to have an abortion. That's certainly not a human right. And once you start playing with that
Oh, so that's
language,
one
you're
of the
playing
ways.
a very dangerous game, and some are doing it purposely.
And the other was the women have a right. What's the right to
To
decide
have full
and
control over and decide freely on all aspects of their sexuality. Now, when we were negotiating that, the language is also added on without discrimination, coercion, or violence, which, of course, we agree with. And then, further language talked about the equal relationships needed between men and women in respect and mutual understanding. That's all great, but during the negotiation process, it was obvious that delegations were trying to get in the concept of the women having a human right to have absolute extreme libertarian control over their sexuality with no kind of moral or legal restraint on that activity.
So this is just
because the sexual rights came out of the sexual orientation lobby. That whole language was being pushed by the sexual orientation lobby. So you see what they're trying to achieve, and they realize they couldn't get explicit language, so they get this vague language instead.
And then they include concepts about reproductive health and sexual health. And that also brings in a lot of baggage.
All code
that one
words.
might, exactly.
And those things that they could not get, like sexual orientation, that will go on. There'll be another conference at the United Nations, and that will be tried again.
Pushing
and
it
probably
again.
no matter what comes up, whether it's environment or what, these will work their way.
They'll work their way into that
There's
document
one
somehow, and
coming up on housing habitat,
and that will be discussed again.
it's being pushed.
Now, Pip, you're
on that.
involved in the preparations for that conference on housing and habitat. Now, how can these reproductive questions be coming up there?
Well, the reproductive hasn't so much. Again, the sexual orientation has been brought in because of discrimination and housing.
Oh, I
but
see.
more so the family. They're trying to again water down the family and substitute household instead of family because they don't want policies based on the normative family.
The normative family, again, we have to say it being
Based
mother,
on marriage,
father, and children.
based on
Children,
marriage
adoption.
or kinship.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, do you think, should we even be involved? I mean, maybe it'd be better just for the Holy See to back out of these
There's
conferences.
times when you sit there and you say,
At 3 in the
maybe
morning.
we should be home. Maybe
Why am I here?
we're not doing all that much good. But when you come back and you look in retrospect at it and you say, well, what would it have been like if we hadn't bothered to go? And I think the honest answer is it would have been a whole lot worse. So, I mean, I don't know whether damage control is
The best thing you can aim for.
But it is damage control, and it's effective.
And we have delegations who come up to us at the UN during and after these conferences, individual delegates who will say, I'm not speaking for my delegation, but I just want to tell you, I'm so glad the Holy See was here, because who knows what would have happened to this document if you hadn't done something about it, and that's important.
And I always think so. Archbishop Martino, the permanent observer at the UN, his whole line about being a witness at the UN, and it's sort of a prophetic role. And if it falls on deaf ears, it falls on deaf ears. But your job is still to say it, because you think this is better for the world and better for people.
Well, our Lord didn't always have a friendly audience to hear what he had to say.
And I think it doesn't always fall on deaf ears. It doesn't mean we end up with a document that we want or would have written by any means.
It's not a catechism.
What people do here, even in Cairo, not only members of other delegations, even the guards who were in the building would come up to
The
some of
Chinese
delegation.
guards you're talking about?
No, now this, I'm sorry, I meant Cairo. This was
Oh,
the Egyptians. And they would come over and say, we're grateful for what the Vatican's doing. Keep
Really?
it up. Yeah.
Well, it sounds to me that it seems to me that you think we ought to stay involved. Of course, the big question is the Pope. What does he think about that?
I don't know. You'll have to ask him.
But you've got some indication of that through Archbishop Martino, who is his delegate to the United Nations.
I know the Holy
right?
Father is still, he obviously very much is concerned about what goes on at the UN. He was just there in October
right.
and gave an address. He's supportive of the UN. He's concerned about some of the ideologies and the directions that the UN is going. But I think it's important that we stay and that we keep struggling. For example, as Pip said, it's just to give another perspective. And maybe at some point the world will wake up and say, these policies we're pushing just aren't working. Maybe the Holy See has a point, and that's what keeps us going.
But that has occurred, hasn't it, already in the past where you've seen it? How many, let's see, who was at Cairo?
I was at Cairo.
You were at Cairo.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Cairo.
You were both at Cairo.
Yeah.
And did you make friends at Cairo that you were able to carry through to Beijing?
There's a few delegates who are the same, but largely the delegations will change from meeting to meeting. It's the individual delegates.
There
who
seemed to
make
be a
the
lot of
difference.
different people in Beijing than had been at Cairo.
More women, obviously.
Do
Yes.
you want to leave us with any thoughts in the last 30 seconds as a staff member of the Holy See's
I guess
mission?
the important thing now, and one thing we keep seeing, is that Catholics themselves need to be more educated about these issues, to understand not just how they affect the moral life of individual Catholics as Catholics, but how these moral issues impact our society and are being spread all over the world. We need to be more aware of that and more involved in how that's affected.
And perhaps bring some pressure to bear on our own country's delegations
certainly.
to these
Absolutely.
conferences. Well, ladies, thank you very, very much. This has been very informative. I trust it's also been informative for our viewing audience. We thank you so much for being with us. We pray that you keep the United Nations in your prayers, because great good can be achieved there as we work toward peace and justice under the guidance of God's Holy Spirit, if people only open themselves to His guidance. Thank you so much for being with us.